So as you know, we're going through this gospel culture series, and it's based on this little green book called The Gospel, written by a pastor named Rayshawn, and I encourage you to pick it up, read it. It talks a lot about what it means for us as a church and as the church to not just believe the gospel and to affirm it in what we say or what we know about Jesus and who he is and what he's come to do in this world, but to have that information actually produce transformation, and not just in us individually, but also for us as a community, as a church, how the gospel shapes our culture. And so one of the things that we don't often hear about, talked about in these sort of unprecedented times that we're living in, is the toll that these unprecedented times are taking and will take on the mental and even emotional health of people all over the world. Anytime that a major event shakes a society, at least particularly in our country, things like anxiety and depression increase significantly. And the increase in these sort of emotions and feelings, it doesn't drop very fast, even after the crisis is over. One article that I read this week, it said this, that after 9/11, a study of more than 36,000 New York residents and rescue workers revealed that more than 14 years after the attack, 14% still had post-traumatic stress disorder, and 15% experienced depression, much higher rates than in comparable populations. The same article went on to say that currently, as of December 2020, more than 42% of people surveyed by the U.S. Census Bureau in December reported symptoms of anxiety or depression in December, an increase from 11% the previous year. Data from other surveys suggests that the picture is similar worldwide. So scientists and psychologists believe that the sources of these emotions, this anxiety and depression, they come from various places, including everything from COVID control measures to news headlines to less social interaction to division in our society, fear of illness. And anxiety and depression has increased all across the board. It's touched everyone demographically, some more than others, but everyone from women and men of all ages and adults and children are experiencing increased anxiety and depression and fear, grief, these feelings of hopelessness. So in a time when hopelessness abounds and uncertainty pervades everything that we see in this world around us, what can the church offer to a world that is struggling with hopelessness, struggling with grief? Well, in the world around us, we see this world that even often shapes us. I think it's been easy for us to, in the face of hopelessness, encounter either a culture of just putting your head down and trying to grin and bear it, where you just sort of push through the hopelessness and the grief and the anxiety by ignoring or minimizing things, just trying to endure and get through it. Even in a Christian sense, this is a kind of sentiment that's behind the whole faith over fear notion. Just believe. Get through it. Sometimes that can even look like positivity or optimism, even a kind of self-driven strength and courage. Or sometimes, even in the face of hopelessness and worry, we're met with a culture of gloom and doom, where everything is just burning and bad, and where we're just leaning all the way into the uncertainty and the grief and expecting the worst, thinking that things will never get better, trying to prepare for that, even expecting the worst from God, but also the worst from the world that we live in. The thing is, brothers and sisters, both of these responses, and whichever one of these responses that we gravitate to more, they're so appealing for us, right? Because they make things more manageable. They make things more controllable in the face of hopelessness. We can do something about them. We're not left to chaos or feeling like we're just all over the place. They give our little pseudo-sovereign selves the option for control that we always love, that we're addicted to. We either control things by controlling what's in our ability and what's in our power, or we control things by expecting the worst and then trying to manage the implications. Just let me know how bad it's going to be. I can wrap my head around it and I can do what I need to do. But both of these cultures, right? Both of these responses that shape us in this world that we live in, they're shallow, they're fleeting. They're hollow and they're very thin, and neither of them offer us real hope. So what is real hope? When we use that word hope, and when you hear that word hope all the time in this world that we live in, what is hope? What does the Bible mean when it's talking about hope? And what does a culture of hope look like in a world of hopelessness and even poor solutions to managing it? What hope do we have in the gospel? And how does this hope shape our interactions with one another? How does this hope define our life together as God's people, as a local expression of this global reality of the church? Well, in Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 5, we're going to look briefly at the gospel doctrine of hope. How the gospel gives us and presents to us a great hope. And then we're going to see from that what a culture of hope looks like. So we'll see, again, gospel doctrine and gospel culture. Let's look at Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. We've recently spent some time in Romans as we've just finished the series on Romans chapter 8, which was filled with words like hope, and faith, and trusting in God and his love for us, knowing that he's working all things together for our good. So we see and we heard, as we hear every week, that the gospel is the good news that comes to us. But it's the good news that comes to us in our particularly hopeless situations. We see all throughout the book of Romans that we are people who are not righteous, meaning that we violate God's law constantly and his standard regularly in our lives. And because of this, we deserve punishment. We deserve death, and there's no amount of good efforts or making up for our sin that we could do to erase our guilt or to even be acceptable before God. We deserve death. We deserve separation from God because of our breaking his law and his requirements. But we see the goodness and the mercy of God is one that offers a way. He offers a way to us. He extends grace and mercy to us in the midst of a hopeless situation. Romans chapter 4 calls this a blessing. This blessing that comes from God of his not counting our crimes against us and then covering our sin. And this doesn't happen by him unjustly looking the other way at our sin or just letting us off the hook without anybody actually paying for it. Now we see that in the gospel, God deals justly with our sin by sending his son Jesus into this world to bear the punishment for sin that we deserve. And in turn, he gives us righteousness, his perfect record that is acceptable before God. And because of that, you and I and all who put faith in Jesus, we are seen as accepted before God, fully accepted, even though we still battle and wrestle and struggle with sin. We don't have to work to persuade God to act mercifully towards us. We don't have to try to earn this status of being more accepted. We don't have to try to score points to get him to like us or love us more. We don't have to try to atone for our own sins to get him to be on our side. We found out that God is on our side because of Jesus. And when we entrust ourselves to Jesus in faith, believing that his perfect life is credited to us, and that his sacrificial work on the cross was for our sin, and that God raised him up from the dead 3 days later as the receipt and the proof that we're fully accepted, we can know that we have a real hope. We have a hope that God is going to bring us to himself in full fellowship and life and joy and satisfaction and peace with him forever. And that gives us hope in a really hopeless world. It's our ultimate hope. God has solved our greatest problem. He's spoken into the deepest hopelessness that anyone in this world could experience, and he's resolved it proactively through Jesus. And so the gospel gives us hope. And there are a few implications to this good news for us and what this hope for us means right now as it pertains to our having hope in this world. So Romans chapter 5, it tells us that the first implication is this: therefore, since we've been justified by faith, we have peace with God, which is what we talked about last week. There's no more war or tension between us and God because of our sin. God, through his son Jesus, has squashed and crushed the hostility that existed between us and God. God has gone the full lengths in his love to bring our unwilling and even unresponsive selves back to him. And he's made peace with us, not by waiting for us to come 50-50 to meet his terms, but he actually goes and gets us, raises us to spiritual life, transforms us, and causes us to be a people of peace. A people who have peace with him vertically, but also a people who have peace with one another horizontally, breaking down the walls of hostility that exist between us in a human sense. Secondly, we see that from Romans chapter 5 that there's this two-sided reality. We have peace with God, but now we see that we have access to God's grace. Unlimited access to God's grace. You think about access and cell phone plans and Wi-Fi plans and how you get charged. And maybe you remember the old days of cell phones where, after you send a certain amount of text message or you go over your minutes, you end up getting charged. You don't have unlimited access to these minutes. You have to wait till Friday night after 9 p.m. That's not grace. Grace is this unlimited access that we have before God. And this is our standing, full access to God's love, his mercy, his kindness. His doors are always open. Eugene Peterson says this: we throw open our doors to God and discover at the same moment that he has already thrown open his doors to us. We find ourselves standing where we always hoped we might stand, right? The hope that we thought was too good to be true, that God would love us unconditionally and be for us, even looking our sins and our crimes and our failures and our sufferings in the face and saying, I'm for you, I love you, I'm with you. This is your standing. It's true, not too good to be true. It's not that you're on God's good side for the moment. It's not that you've done enough this week and then God's face is favorable towards you, right? It's not that you're just on God's good side. It's that God has placed himself on our side through Jesus. And his face, his countenance is continuously shining on us in grace and in love. That's inexhaustible. That's our standing. That's where we're at. That is our address as his people in his grace. God's doors are open to you right now, brothers and sisters. If our faith is in the person and work of Jesus, if we're not counting on our own righteousness and our own good works or our own morality or thinking that we are too far removed from this thing ever happening for us, if we're trusting in Jesus, grace is our standing. His doors are open. I went to a local Starbucks this week, the one that I always go to. As soon as I got to the door, I found out that the hours had changed from 12 to 7. I'm like, 12 to 7, it was 8 a.m. I was ready to get to work, ready for my coffee. Y'all done changed the hours. No one comes to Starbucks at 12 p.m. until 7 p.m. You're turning the morning crowd down. God's grace doesn't change its hours, right? His doors are always open. It's not be back in a minute. It's not one day you'll be good enough to come in. No, he's there. Even after everything you've gotten yourself into this week and after everything that's going on in this world around us that causes you to feel the heavy burden of hopelessness, God's doors are open to you right now. And that means something for how you and I can approach this life and this world. Brothers and sisters, our being accepted by God and our standing with God in his grace right now means this. Look at Romans 5. It means that we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. We have access to his grace. That's our standing. And the other side of this coin is that We rejoice, knowing that this is our standing. This is the emotional response that it produces. No matter what the circumstance or situation is, we rejoice, not looking at the circumstances and the situations of hopelessness, but we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. God's glory and God's greatness is not a hopeful thing if we are not in His grace. And yet we can rejoice and hope in God's glory because God is for us and with us in Jesus. Again, there's no skepticism here. There's a real rejoicing, no looking over your shoulder, no wondering if maybe everybody else is in on this and you're not. No, we can rejoice. No looking at our sins and our sufferings and wondering if we really should be rejoicing in God. Again, our acceptance with God has cleared the way for us to be able to rejoice in something that we don't deserve and even had no business rejoicing in. God's doors are open through the gospel, through Jesus. And you and I can rejoice in this hope of God's glory. Essentially, this means that you and I, brothers and sisters, we have a bright future. We have a bright future that we can be joyful about right now. It's not heaven that's far off. It's not one day that things will be better. Certainly, that's a part of it. But we can rejoice right now, even in a hopeless world, because we have a hope, an eternal hope, that is the glory of God. And even though that's not fully realized, what Romans 5 is telling us here is that we can rejoice even in the prospect of that hope, the promise of it. So God's glory, the hope of God's glory, is something that can give us joy right now in the present. So what does God's glory mean? What does it mean to hope in God's glory? That sounds really big and general and disconnected from whatever it is that our lives are. What does it mean to hope in God's glory? And how can that actually connect to my life, but also my relationships, my culture, this church? What does it mean to have hope in God's glory? Well, I think if we could summarize what God's glory is and even what it means a bunch of things, but we could say that essentially it means this. It's His greatness, the weightiness of His greatness, the overwhelming reality of His supremacy and His greatness that stands, that exists. It's His greatness that stands behind His being for us in our lives and in this world. It's the greatness of His goodness. It's the greatness of His love, the greatness of His mercy and kindness, so that whenever you experience these little glimpses and pictures of mercy and kindness and love and peace in this world through either regular interactions or through your regular rhythms and day jobs, those are faint and smoldering embers compared to this weighty reality of grace and goodness and kindness and love that God displays to you and me through Jesus. It's weighty. It is overwhelming in the best sense. Again, it's this weighty reality of His protection of us. This weighty reality of His power in sustaining us, transforming us, keeping us, not losing us. His glory and His greatness towards us in this way. That's what His glory means, and the weightiness of it. It's meant to overwhelm us, and it's meant to produce joy in us, especially in the midst of hopelessness. So, brothers and sisters, how often are you considering the glory of God? And not just thinking about it, not just reading about it and having it be something that exists in your mind in an information sense only. But do the dots ever connect? Can you say, or when's the last time that you can say that you have been hit up in your soul with the weightiness of God's glory? Maybe the weightiness of His goodness towards you, His grace, His kindness, His love for you. When's the last time that the dots connected? And that eternal reality that exists so high above us actually worked its way down into your ordinary, regular life. And you experienced a deep sense of God's love for you, his care, his provision, his protection. The overwhelming reality of that. What did you think? How did you respond? Why is it so hard for us to connect the dots? Do you feel far away from this kind of reality? Again, God wants to display this glory, this weightiness of his glory. Even if you just ask. Look at Moses, right? Show me your glory. And God answers the request. Certainly nobody can see my face and live, God says, but I'll hide you in the cleft of a rock and I'll pass by you. They're not talking about really high experiences or things like that. Sure, that's great, but just the weighty reality of what God has done by sending his son Jesus. The glory of his son. And what that means for your soul. Again, when's the last time that really settled in? The greatness of God. Because Romans makes the case and makes the point that this greatness, this glory of God is meant to give us joy. It's meant to cause us to rejoice. You keep reading in Romans, particularly in suffering and particularly in a world full of hopelessness. God knows what's going on. God sees everything that threatens our hope. Everything that pursues us and stalks us, waiting to drag us into hopelessness. And he doesn't intend to leave you alone or wait for you to find this hopeless or this hope that he intends to give us. No, he wants to give us hope in the midst of hopelessness by showing us his glory, particularly what he's done through the person and work of Jesus. So when we think about God's glory, and we talked about God's glory, right? We say that it has a kind of weightiness, right? It's heavy. It's meant to overwhelm us with joy and goodness, but hopelessness has its own kind of weight too, right? It has its own kind of glory. A glory that all of us, many of us, are experiencing now or have experienced or will experience. The weight of hopelessness. Anxiety, depression, grief. All of those things have a heaviness that can be overwhelming to us and impossible to lift or even penetrate through. When people are describing this in books or in sermons or even just different life experiences, they often talk about the reality of hopelessness being like dark clouds that settle in. That even though the sun is there, it doesn't really matter because you're not feeling its light and its warmth. Hopelessness has clouded your vision. And with all the storms that we've been having recently, just in the weather, get a chance to look outside of the window sometimes just before one of those big storms that we see. And you can see and even feel somewhat of the glory of those massive dark thunderclouds. You kind of, if you're outside, you're bringing the groceries in, you kind of duck down a little bit because you don't know why you do that. You're not trying to get struck by lightning, right? You do it too. I do it. You feel the glory of the thunderstorm. And when hopelessness kicks in, when we're infected by hopelessness, we feel that too. We go internal. We don't want to trust. We don't want to get out. We want to hunker down and stay within our souls. That's what that glory and weightiness of hopelessness produces. This kind of dread. What we see here in Romans is that God's glory and the weightiness of God's glory is exponentially and incomparably greater. It's greater, and just like hopelessness and the weightiness of it brings dread and fear and disappointment, God's glory brings joy. God's glory is meant to give you and cultivate rejoicing, a real rejoicing. Not a plastered smile, not a grinning and bearing it, but a real rejoicing even amidst real and deep sorrow. Think about this weight of God's glory, this weight of this hope that we have. You think about Jesus' life and ministry, right? How he comes into this world, and this is the heart, and he displays the heart and the disposition of God in his life and his ministry towards hopeless people. Again, God knows what's going on in this world full of hopelessness. And Jesus, he displays this when he says and he does things to give hopeless people assurance, to ease their fear, to uplift people who are downcast. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, he says, don't be anxious. Don't be anxious. And he says this to people who are worried about where their next meal is coming from and what kind of clothes they're going to wear tomorrow, where their provision is going to come from. He goes on and asks his disciples, why are you afraid in the middle of a storm? Just before calming it. On the night before his death, and even before he leaves them, before things get the worst for Jesus and for his disciples, Jesus tells them, don't let your hearts be troubled. Take courage. Take heart. Why, he says? Because I've overcome the world. Now listen, right? We tell each other these kinds of things, right? Don't be anxious. Why are you afraid? Grin and bear it. Don't let your heart be troubled. And we say that with a sense of positivity and optimism, right? But we don't have any real assurance that things are going to be okay. I mean, we think they are. We control the controllables. We manage. Or in gloom and doom, we think if we just hunker down enough, we'll get through it. Jesus doesn't say these things without any assurance. Jesus makes these simple statements, these hopeful statements, not to just persuade or convince his followers or really downcast and hopeless people to just hang in there. No, he grounds these statements of hope in God's glory and in God's greatness. Sometimes with words that communicate that and are connected to that, but also at times with actions, miraculous demonstrations that point to the weighty glory and greatness of God that is for his people. So when Jesus says, don't be anxious, he points to the greatness of God's provision, right? He feeds the birds. He clothes the flowers. When he tells his disciples not to fear the storm, he proceeds to calm it. He tells it to go away. When he tells them to take courage and to not let their hearts be troubled, he goes on to tell them that he's going to the Father. He is going to the Father, and he is going to come back for them to bring them to the Father. Again, the greatness. Jesus' statements of hope are connected to the greatness and glory of God, particularly displayed in who he is. So Jesus isn't saying, don't be afraid, guys. Just tough it out. He also isn't saying, hey, it's going to get really bad. Just try to manage through it. He doesn't give them a hope that's uncertain. Rather, what he does is that he reinforces their hope with the weighty reality of God's greatness. And because God is unchanging, because God is there, because he's not going anywhere, they can rejoice even in the midst of hopelessness. And because God is there for us and with us, you and I can rejoice as well. God's glory is our hope, brothers and sisters. Or even as the CSB is, CSB says God's glory and greatness is what we can boast in. So that's why Paul keeps going on talking about the implications of God being on our side through Jesus. And because of this hope that we have in the glory of God, a hope that's meant to produce real joy within us, we can rejoice even in the times and the seasons where we feel hopelessness, anxiety, fear, doubt, and depression the most. We rejoice even in the midst of our afflictions, is what Paul says. Now, we know what affliction feels right? We know what that feels like, right? We know it feels heavy. God's greatness and his glory being on our side in Jesus means that even in the most hopeless situations, God hasn't left us, brothers and sisters. He hasn't left us alone. He hasn't abandoned us. He's not waiting for us to toughen up and grin and bear it. Again, he's proactively at work on us and in us, causing us to endure, and at the same time cultivating our character and aligning us with himself, clearing out the clouds of hope so as to give us the clouds of hopelessness so as to give us more hope. So overall, in the midst of our hopelessness, this hope that we have in Jesus means that in the midst of our afflictions and sufferings and anxieties and depression and fears, we can be assured that God is not going to disappoint us. God is not going to disappoint you, brothers and sisters. God will not disappoint you. We will face disappointment and affliction and all of the things that we feel during anxiety and suffering and stress and grief. But God will not disappoint us. Isn't that what makes hopelessness sting the most? The disappointment? Isn't that what we fear the most when we face hopelessness? Well, we can know that God's glory and his greatness is powerful enough to break through the heaviness of hopelessness and give real light and real joy to our souls. Even when anxiety and depression and fear and grief don't automatically go away. God wants to give us real joy, even in the midst of real disappointment and hopelessness. What would it look like, brothers and sisters, if we believe that? In the midst of experiencing the real things that we do, things that pull us towards hopelessness, what would it look like for us to believe that God will not disappoint us? That he is powerfully and proactively on our side, working for us and in us for our joy, so that we might rejoice in him. Again, it's not always easy to connect those dots. It's not always easy to do that legwork ourselves. If we're really honest, when we're facing grief and hopelessness and loss and fear, we don't feel like doing that at all. Sometimes that must be done for us. Sometimes other people are involved in helping us with that. And that's what it looks like for gospel doctrine to take on and shape gospel culture. When individually, you and I are people who at times face hopelessness and disappointments, and we don't always feel like connecting the dots. We have a family that has a culture that is committed to helping us connect the dots between the hope and the greatness of God's glory and the hopelessness that we feel and experience as God's people. So what does it look like for this hope of God's glory to be the foundation of our life together? What does it look like for this hope of the glory of God to shape us, even more than the cultures of false hope and uncertainty that we live in every single day? What does it look like to live in a culture of hope? Well, it means a few things, and for time's sake, I wish I could go through more of them because it means so many things, especially in this kind of context, in this world that God has strategically placed us in now. A culture of hope means a few things. Firstly, it means that there's this transcendent reality that a more powerful person, a more loving and gracious person, an all-knowing person is committed to our endurance and our character and our joy in our seasons of hopelessness even more than we are. That's the good news of the gospel, that it's not up to you to motivate and muster hope, to cultivate this sense of rejoicing in the midst of hopelessness. That's crazy. You can't do that after a rough week. No matter how hard you try, no matter how much optimism or positivity that you drown yourself in, hope doesn't work like that. Hopelessness doesn't work like that. But the gospel presents to us this reality that this great God is on our side and he is at work. It is his promise to give you joy. It is his promise to work within you and to start and begin and continue a work that he will bring to completion. He is at work. You can know that. You can believe that. You can rest on that. It's a pillow for you to lay your head on. There is a transcendent and all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God who's come into this world to be near you, to live in you, and is also working amidst all the small details, the hopeless realities, the frustrating circumstances, the overwhelming situations. He's at work. And he's at work for your good. He doesn't have it out for you. He doesn't have your worst interest in mind. He actually cares about you. And even when you don't feel like lifting a finger towards moving towards hope, he is there. And that's what it means to not act and live and move as a Christian and trying to put forth effort, but at times to be a child of God, to exist as someone who is kept, redeemed, and transformed by God, and to just hope in him. God is more committed to these things than we are. Even the second reality is that he's committed to these things even more than we can be committed to each other. When we encounter one another in seasons and situations of hopelessness, what do we want to do, right? We want to pull each other out of that, and we will go to great lengths to try to do that. But oftentimes it takes more than that. Sometimes the weight of hopelessness is so heavy that we can't just throw somebody over our shoulders and carry them out of that pit. It won't work. We can't be persuasive enough. We can't say enough. We can't cliche enough, right? We can't optimism and positivity enough. And that's a burden that sometimes is really heavy on us as well. But God is committed. God is committed even more than we are to each other. God is committed to that person on the other side of hopelessness. He's committed to you in hopelessness. See, as many times that we try to look for silver linings or give people lists of things to do or even distract ourselves or try to distract other people from hopelessness and depression and anxiety and grief, at the end of that time, we're really tired. We grow frustrated. How are those things working out? How have those things worked out? Sometimes they give us temporary relief, but oftentimes none of those things are permanent solutions to hopelessness. So if you're feeling hopeless or stuck or afraid or uncertain or grieving, you can know, brothers and sisters, that there is a God who knows this, and he's not going to disappoint you. And when it comes to each other, we can rest in the fact as brothers and sisters, as family, we can rest in the fact that we're limited in solving or speaking into the hopelessness that our brothers and sisters go through. We're limited. We don't have the answers. We don't have the power. But we can know that God, by his Spirit, is at work, comforting the hopeless, grieving with, feeling what we feel. And he is committed to bringing those who are experiencing hopelessness in whatever form to himself and giving them joy. A question for us is, will we commit to loving one another and bearing with one another and being there for one another in the midst of our seasons of hopelessness? Will we stay patient? Will we stay loving? Will we be reminded of the greatness of God displayed on our behalf and then display that greatness of love and goodness and peace and kindness towards one another? We don't have to hope in the power of our cliches or our ability to motivate or persuade one another. We can trust in God's word. We can look at his promises. We can see the things that he said and the realities that he's made known for his people. And we can point one another to those things and encourage one another that God will not abandon us. And so as we're moving towards one another in seasons and times of hopelessness, we might not always have something to say. We don't always need to have something to say. We don't have to be great for each other, whether you're experiencing hopelessness or whether you're trying to encourage someone experiencing hopelessness. You don't have to be great. God is great. And so we point one another to his greatness. We remind each other that if God has displayed his glory and his greatness for us at the cross of Christ, greatness displayed for the deepest kind of hopelessness, then he can take care of the hopelessness and despair that we feel in seasons of suffering and affliction. One more implication here. Next, the culture of hope means that we can genuinely rejoice in God's greatness together, especially in the seasons when we encounter hopelessness and grief. What is the church? It's a people, right? Not a building. But when the people of God gather together, this should be a place, and this is the place where hopelessness-prone people should be able to come together with all of the burdens that have been placed on us over the past week and month and seasons of our lives. All of the fears, all of the anxieties, all of the depression, all of the despair that we go through and carry into places like this. This should be the place where we can come in with all of these things and put them before God and lean in to worshiping God and seeing that his greatness is greater than the greatness of our hopelessness. And we can do this in a way that doesn't just see ourselves worshiping God, right? Thinking of ourselves singing the songs, thinking about the greatness of God displayed towards us. But no, in your bringing your burdens in you're bringing your hopelessness in here, you get a chance, you get an opportunity that you don't get anywhere else in this world to see other people bringing their hopelessness, bringing their burdens, bringing their anxieties, bringing their fears and their doubts, and you get to see them rejoice in the greatness of God that you need just as much as they do. That is a culture of hope. That doesn't happen out there. It's different from a grief group. It's different from just a commonality place where you just talk about and put out your misery and the things that are going on and just to sort of have that company. No, you come in with real burdens and you meet a real solution to those burdens. And you watch other people meet a real solution to those burdens. You watch people draw joy from the greatness and glory of God, even though they may be deeply, deeply sorrowful. That's not optimism, brothers and sisters. That's not an opiate. It's not hype. It's not an emotionalism and a toying with your emotions to help you feel better for an hour and a half. Think about this. When I was thinking about this as I was studying, I can say personally that I have tremendously benefited and been encouraged and been immensely impressed on powerfully by God. Watching people that I know are struggling. People that I know are dealing with really hopeless situations and realities. Watching some of you and the things that you have gone through, watching you worship and sing and cry and pray and call out to God in your souls. You know how much of a balm that is to souls dealing with hopelessness? How much of an encouraging factor that is in cultivating joy? That's a culture of hope. I see you looking at the greatness of God, sorrowful but always rejoicing, and you see me looking at the greatness of God, sorrowful and always rejoicing, and we are together looking at the greatness of God and rejoicing in the midst of a hopeless world. We don't always have answers. Again, it's not an adrenaline shot for us to get through the next week. It's a real foundation. It's a real eternal hope. Because When we get together, we can see the prospect of this reality that will one day come to full fruition in our lives. We get a glimpse of that right now. What a testament. What a testament to see, hear other brothers and sisters bringing their burdens into a place like this, into a community, and being pointed to, singing about, praising the greatness of God in it. So listen, if you come into places like this with it all grinning and bearing it and putting it together and you're yelling at the kids in the car and you're smiling and it's all good, you don't have to come in here like that. If things are hopeless and really bad, come in with them really bad. Because by praising God and rejoicing, even if it's just with your hands in your pocket or just mouthing the words, you can see what's happening for others. You can ask God that if your heart is cold, I see that brother or sister over there singing, crying, praising. Can you do that for me? We don't hide our burdens or our hopelessness or our fears or our anxieties or our worries. We bring them into places like this because that's how we see a culture of hope. Brothers and sisters, a culture of hope means that in a world filled with heaviness and hopelessness, we're people who make much and emphasize not our greatness, not our ability to endure, not our strength and our nobility, not our best strategies to eliminate hopelessness, but we make much of God's greatness, God's glory. And we rejoice in that, even as we weep and mourn and grieve. I don't know what that looks like all the time. Rejoicing and being sorrowful, as Paul said. Like what? But it's real. We believe that God has a bright future for us because of Jesus. And therefore, we invite one another to see that. We point to the glory and the greatness of God, not to ourselves, not to somebody else. We're people committed to graciously, lovingly pointing one another to God and what he's done in the person and work of Jesus, turning from our sin and the ways that we are affected by a sin-filled world. And we trust in God. We trust in Jesus as he is our only hope. Let me pray for us.